right, so today we are going to continue talking about feudal Japan. And when talking about feudal Japan, we're going to talk about the castles. I went over the castles a little bit in detail last time. We didn't get a huge amount of detail into it, but we did talk about these a little bit last time. We did get into these a bit. And what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about kind of just the differences between these castle designs. We're going to talk a little bit about the differences between these castle designs here. So we're going to, it's not quite a, I guess it's not really a bullet for this, because we're kind of just talking about castles here. We're kind of just going to write down some information about both. But we're going to talk about our Europe castles, and we're going to talk about our Japan castles, or Japanese castles. So you can kind of see here from our Japanese castles, you can see how both of them in both of our examples, you can see how they're stone on the bottom, and then up on your top, you have your wood. We did talk about before how I had fire-resistant plaster was used to put on the side of these buildings. So they did have flame-resistant plaster. However, you still put enough fire into one area, they are still going to catch on fire. Same thing with the wall here. It will catch on fire if enough fire gets onto it. All right, so it will catch on fire eventually, which in terms of, of course, in European castles in which they're completely made out of stone, they're not going to catch on fire. But of course, Japan couldn't do that because, Japan is about the size of California, and they just didn't have access to the same amount of natural resources as Europe did. So for Europe and Japan here, let's first start off with our European castles. So I guess we'll make a bullet, and let's write down Europe/Japan, and we're going to write down castles. So Europe/Japan castles. So let's start off with the Europe castles first, and kind of three things about them. So we'll make a one, we'll write down Europe, and then let's actually make an equal sign next to it, and then we'll write down about these castles and what makes them kind of a little bit different compared to Japanese castles. So starting off with these castles, one, they're made out of stone. So we talked about it before. They're completely made out of stone. They have high walls, that are about 20 to 40 feet high. The walls, though, can be broken eventually if you smash them in enough with something heavy, like a catapult. So they're not necessarily weak to a catapult, but the walls will eventually crumble if a stone hits them hard enough. Well, not hard enough if it hits them enough times. So one, Europe equal sign stone, high walls, and weak to catapults. So Europe equal sign stone, high walls, weak to catapults. So catapult is just when you're basically chucking a heavy rock at the wall, and it doesn't break on one time. I know a lot of times in movies they make it seem like, one catapult rock hits the wall and it all breaks down. That's not how it works. You're talking about shooting rocks at a wall for months, and that's just that one section of a wall to eventually get it to collapse. All right, so it's basically you're just delivering a force to another object, and you're moving the stones out so that the entire wall collapses. So if the entire wall was one solid piece, like one solid rock, like if there was a rock that was like 40 foot tall, that wall would never come down to a catapult, just never. But these are rocks instead that are cemented together, kind of with like limestone. So you have limestone cement that connects all the rocks together. That cement connection can be eventually broken, and that's when the walls come crumbling down. So if you can get a rock, if you can break its cement binding and push it out of position, it will cause the wall to kind of collapse. But again, that takes some time. That's not just a one-day thing. You're talking, months of shooting a wall, depending on how good the wall is. You might show up and the wall might fall pretty quickly, but generally it takes a while. Even a cannon shooting at stone wall takes a while. You can imagine with a catapult just chucking a heavy rock at it, how long that might take. So it takes a long time. All right, so then we're going to make a 2. Let's write down Japan, and then we'll make an equal sign. And then we're going to write down. So generally for Japanese castle, it's a stone base and wood on top. So it's a stone base, and then that wood is on top. It's weak to fire. So it is weak to fire if it's in, one concentrated area. So it's got a stone base, wood up on top. It is weak to fire, of course, if it's in a concentrated area. All right. So that's our bullet. That's one. That's two. Okay. So eventually what ends up happening is that after the year 1300, Japan kind of breaks down into these various provinces with various people controlling various areas. And you have various daimyos going around. And there are people that were kind of competing to be the strongest lord, to be the shogun that kind of controlled the entire area. And Europeans eventually kind of arrive in the area, and they bring some things with them. They bring firearms in the area, and they also bring Christianity. Let's make a bullet. Let's write down bullet. Europeans arrive in Japan. So we got bullet. Europeans arrive in Japan. And then we'll make a 1 firearms and 2 Christianity. So 1 firearms, 2 Christianity. So when the Europeans arrive in Japan, they bring with them 2 things, firearms and Christianity. Firearms being guns. Now, gunpowder is originally made in China, but the gunpowder invention eventually makes its way over to Europe, and they figure out how to make guns real good with the gunpowder. They bring then those gunpowder weapons over to Japan. The Japanese then kind of pick up those gunpowder weapons from Europeans when they start to kind of arrive in the area. Christianity is also brought into the area as well. So you also have Christian missionaries coming to the area, and Christianity kind of gets in Japan. Japan is still very much a Shinto Buddhist nation, but Christianity is also there as well in Japan. So those are the 2 big things that Europeans kind of bring into Japan when they came to the area. So eventually what ends up happening is that there's a guy named Oda. And Oda Nobunaga, he really takes in this Christianity aspect and these guns and so forth. And he really starts to kind of spread out his territory. So this dark blue right there, that's Oda's original territory. The light blue is all the territory that Oda Nobunaga ends up taking over. So he ends up taking over like all this territory. So he ends up taking over a huge amount of territory, and he becomes the shogun of Japan because he has Kyoto under control. Remember, Kyoto is where the emperor lives. So with Kyoto under his control, he controls all of Japan. There is inbred, of course, people that kind of oppose him. So what ends up happening then is Oda Nobunaga, he's eventually betrayed. And when he gets betrayed, he's killed. His oldest son is killed. His second oldest son is then in charge. However, the guy that takes over after Oda Nobunaga, like the most strongest lord after him, Hideyoshi, decides, nah, I don't want to listen to like this little kid. So Hideyoshi ends up killing Oda Nobunaga's son, and then he ends up taking over control of Japan. Well, then Hideyoshi ends up dying a few years later. His oldest son is 6, and then the next guy who's the most powerful lord is like, I'm not listening to a 6-year-old. So, then he takes over. So then you have another guy, Tokugawa's, this area right down here. The Tokugawas then end up taking over. All right, so Oda Nobunaga was in control. Then he gets assassinated. Hideyoshi takes over control, but then he ends up dying. Tokugawa's like, I'm not listening to a 6-year-old. So then he ends up taking over. But when Tokugawa takes over, there's a huge civil war then in between the west half and the east half. Okay, so you see Tokugawa's over here in the east half. So it's kind of the east versus the west. So there's a giant war between those 2 guys. And there's a deciding battle at Sekigahara right here. So Sekigahara is right here in Japan. All right, so right in between the east and west halves of Japan. So there's a big battle called Sekigahara. And at Sekigahara, Tokugawa ends up battling another guy, Ishida. So Ishida and Tokugawa, they end up getting this big battle at Sekigahara. And in this big battle at Sekigahara, what ends up happening, of course, they're using gunpowder weapons and so forth, and they have cannons. And they're kind of fighting in battle. And in the battle, there's one guy who's kind of over here on this hill. and he didn't know who he was going to support. He didn't know if he was going to support if he was going to support Ishida, if he was going to support Tokugawa. He was actually kind of in between about who he was going to support. And during the battle, Tokugawa gets annoyed. He starts firing off some cannons at this guy. So he ends up firing some cannons at him. And then he decides, all right, fine, I'll take my army and I'll go fight against Ishida. So even though Tokugawa fired at him, he was like, all right, I guess I won't fight against Tokugawa. So then he turns his army, which is over here, these guys, turns them, and then they end up attacking into Ishida. So Ishida gets betrayed by this guy who said he was going to join him, but he also said he was going to join Tokugawa in all fairness as well. And then he ends up attacking Ishida. Ishida ends up getting defeated by Tokugawa at the battle. So at the battle, Tokugawa wins. Tokugawa then takes over control of Japan. And Tokugawas will be in charge of Japan for quite a while. They will actually be in charge of Japan from this point, 1600, until the mid 1800s. So they'll be in charge of Japan for about the next 250 years. Let's make a bullet, and we're going to write down Tokugawa Shogunate period. So bullet, Tokugawa Shogunate period. And after you have bullet Tokugawa Shogunate period, we're going to make a 1. Japan closed off all trade. So the Tokugawas, unlike Oda was very accepting of Christianity and firearms and so forth. The Tokugawas are not. They're very opposed to Christianity. They're opposed to Europeans coming in the area. They're very against foreigners coming into the area. They don't really like foreigners. So they're very opposed to foreigners, opposed to firearms, opposed to Christianity coming to the area. So they really closed down the country to all trade. However, they would let the Dutch and Chinese trade with them. The Chinese could trade anywhere in Japan. The Dutch were restricted to Nagasaki. The Japanese, like the Dutch, there's a historical reason for it, but there's basically one guy comes over to Japan who's Dutch, and he ends up staying in the area and so forth, and ends up getting kind of set up with contacts in Netherlands, and it kind of goes from there. But this came out, the Dutch are kind of liked by Japanese because of like one dude. I think his name was William, but I forget his last name. All right, and then last thing, make a 2, and write down merchant class becomes rich. So 2, merchant class becomes rich. So the merchants in Japan, they end up making a whole bunch of money because, well, they closed off the trade from everybody else. So you only got one person then to trade with, and that's going to be the merchants that live in Japan as it is. So 2, merchant class becomes rich. All right, once you got that, that's it for today's notes.